I stood there, fingers wrapped tight around the rope of the old swing. Patricia's eyes bore into me, her lips twisted in that smug way she had when she was sure she'd already won. "You've got 24 hours to remove this eyesore. If not, you'll see a fine you won't be able to pay." Her voice was sweet, too sweet, like she was offering a favor, not issuing a threat. I let out a breath, standing taller. "You're making a mistake," I said, looking her dead in the eye. "I'm not taking it down." She laughed, the sound sharp and unforgiving. "Oh, you will. This isn't a negotiation. The HOA rules are clear. Either you follow them, or there are consequences." Her eyes flicked over the old swing like it was a disease, an eyesore that didn't belong. I had spent months battling in my head, wondering how far I could push back. How much was I willing to sacrifice for this? For that swing? For the memory of my father, who had passed 2 years ago, leaving me his home, the house where we used to laugh and share stories, the place my daughter Ella had grown up in, where every corner held a memory. "I don't think you understand," I said, voice low and steady. "This swing? It's not just decoration, it's a connection to my father. You touch it, you touch everything he left behind for me." Patricia blinked, a flicker of hesitation passing over her face, but it was gone before I could catch it. "It's a swing. It's not worth ruining the integrity of this neighborhood," she said. "You're holding on to some nostalgic nonsense that has no place in a community like this." She turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, but not before she added, "Remove it, or else." If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. I waited until she was out of sight before I turned back to the swing. My heart pounded, the anger simmering under my skin. I wasn't going to back down. This wasn't about some outdated rule. This was my legacy, my promise to my father. My hands traced the rough wood of the swing, worn down by time and memories. It was more than just a piece of furniture in the yard. It was a symbol of everything I'd lost and everything I still had to protect. When my father built it, he didn't just build a swing, he built a foundation, something that anchored us, something to hold on to when everything else was uncertain. That swing was mine, and I'd be damned if Patricia Marsh, or anyone, was going to take it away. "Where are you watching from?" I knew what I had to do. The HOA had chosen the wrong person to mess with. They had no idea what they were up against, but they would soon learn. I wasn't going to just roll over and let them push me out of my own home. I'd make sure of that. The next day I walked out the front door to find a letter shoved into the mailbox, just like the others. Thick, official-looking, and unmistakably Patricia's work. I didn't even need to open it to know it was a warning. The HOA had its claws deep in this community, and I was just another target in their eyes. It was the same routine, another fine, another ultimatum, another pointless violation. But this one was different. It came with a personal threat. The letter claimed the swing wasn't just a violation of HOA rules. No, Patricia had taken it a step further. Now she was accusing me of endangering the safety of the neighborhood. Apparently my swing was unsuitable for children, a danger to anyone who might dare to get near it. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Unsuitable for children? Ella had spent hours playing on that swing when she was younger, her laughter ringing through the yard. The same swing my father had built for her, hoping one day she'd share the same joy we had when I was a kid. As I stood there holding the letter, I glanced over at the neighbors, quiet, withdrawn, afraid. Their houses, each one pristine and perfectly manicured, all stood as if frozen in time, under the thumb of the HOA's iron grip. I had always been a quiet neighbor, never one for drama, but today, as I looked around, I realized just how deep Patricia's control went. She wasn't just trying to enforce rules, she was suffocating the life out of this community. I could hear the whispers when I passed by, neighbors talking in hushed voices about how their gardens had been fined for not following the approved designs, how one family was threatened with legal action for painting their fence a shade too dark. I wasn't the only one being targeted, but it sure felt like the HOA had singled me out. I hadn't realized how bad things had gotten until now, how far Patricia was willing to go to tighten her hold over all of us. I walked to Angela's house, the one next door. She was sitting on her porch, flipping through a book, but when she saw me approaching, her face tightened in an unreadable way. She had seen Patricia's reign up close. She had lived here longer than I had, and I knew she was a lawyer before retiring, though she never talked much about it. "Hey, Angela," I said, leaning on the fence. "I got another letter. This time, they're claiming the swing's unsafe, but I'm pretty sure it's just another tactic." She looked up at me, and for a moment I saw the internal struggle in her eyes. She knew what Patricia was doing. She knew how it worked. But Angela had always been cautious. She never got involved in anything, not since her husband passed a few years ago. "I don't know, Nathan," she said, her voice hesitant. "I mean, you've got to admit, Patricia's right in a way. The swing does seem a little out of place. This neighborhood has certain standards." The words stung, though I knew she didn't mean to hurt me. But what Angela didn't understand was that these standards weren't about the neighborhood anymore. They were about control. And I wasn't about to let anyone erase my father's legacy for the sake of conformity. "No, Angela," I said firmly. "It's not about the swing. It's about what she's doing to all of us. These rules, they're just a way to push us around. If we don't fight back now, it's only going to get worse." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "You're right. I know you're right. But I've kept my head down for so long. I don't know if I'm ready to—" I stopped her with a soft gesture. "I get it, but you're not alone in this. We can take her on. We have to." She looked away, clearly torn, but I saw the shift. There was something in her eyes that told me she wasn't as sure of the HOA's power as she once was. She wasn't ready to take a stand just yet, but I knew she would be. I found Angela in her garden the next morning, crouched low, carefully trimming her plants. She didn't see me at first, but I saw the way her hands trembled, the scissors shaking slightly as they snipped away at the dead leaves. It wasn't like her. Angela was always calm, precise, like she'd been trained for every situation life threw at her. But now she looked vulnerable, torn. I waited for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to keep pretending, Angela," I said quietly. She froze, the scissors in her hand still. Slowly she turned her head toward me, her expression guarded. "Pretending?" she asked, though I could hear the unspoken question. She knew exactly what I meant. "Pretending this doesn't bother you," I said, stepping closer. "You know what Patricia's doing. You've seen it for years, and now she's taken it too far. The swing, that's just the beginning. She'll come after everything. Our homes, our choices, our freedom." Angela sighed, standing up and dusting off her knees. She didn't look at me as she did, her gaze instead fixed on the neat rows of flowers that bordered her garden. "I don't know what you want me to say," she muttered. "You're right, but I've kept my head down for so long, Nathan. I've watched the board get worse, but I've never—" Her voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw the weight of her hesitation, the weight of the fear that had kept her silent for so long. "You've never stood up, right?" I asked, my voice soft but firm. "You've never fought back. But that's why things have gotten this bad. If people like you don't speak up, the rest of us just get steamrolled." She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before. Regret. It was the kind of regret you only feel when you've lived through 100 small compromises, when you've chosen to stay quiet to avoid the trouble. But now, trouble had come knocking on her door, and mine too. "I don't know if I can do this, Nathan," she said, her voice barely above, a whisper. "I've seen how Patricia works, how she tears people apart. She'll do everything she can to make us pay." "Exactly," I replied, my voice steady. "That's why we have to act now, not just for me, not just for my father's swing, but for everyone in this neighborhood. Patricia has built a system where people are too afraid to fight back, and we're going to change that." Angela shifted on her feet, eyes still averted. "But what if it doesn't work?" she asked, her voice strained. "What if she comes after us and—" "She will," I cut her off. "She's already coming after us. But that's the thing, Angela. We don't have to let her. There's a way out of this. I've been researching the HOA laws. They've been operating illegally for years. They're not even properly incorporated." Her head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that the HOA's whole system is a house of cards," I explained. "They've been breaking the law for years, and they don't even know it. I've got the proof, enough to bring this whole thing down. But I need you. We need to expose this, together." She didn't say anything for a long moment, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the years of silence, the fear. It was all there, but there was something else too, a flicker of determination. I don't know how much I can help, she said slowly. But I'm in. If this really is as bad as you say, then we've got to do something about it. That was all I needed to hear. Angela might not be fully on board yet, but she was no longer a passive observer. She was willing to act. The following week, things only escalated. Patricia Marsh was relentless. Every day I'd walk out to find more notices stapled to my door or shoved into my mailbox. This time, she wasn't just targeting the swing. No, she had bigger plans. The HOA had now decided that my entire yard violated approved aesthetic guidelines, and they were threatening me with a massive fine unless I re-landscaped the entire property to meet her standards. I knew it was just another way to break me down, make me feel small, like I didn't belong in this neighborhood. But it wasn't working, not anymore. I stood in the front yard, surveying the damage. Patricia's reign of control was everywhere now. The once pristine houses had become nothing more than cardboard cutouts all the same, all made to look perfect under the watchful eye of the HOA. No room for individuality, no space for history. My house was the last bit of character left, and Patricia had it in her sights. I felt the anger stirring again, hot and sharp. I wasn't going to let this woman strip everything that mattered to me away, piece by piece. I turned toward the old swing, the symbol of my father's legacy. I wasn't sure how much longer it could last. Patricia was determined to break me. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I had to fight back, and I needed to do it smart. Patricia was too powerful to just take on head-to-head, not yet. I needed to hit her where it hurt, where it mattered. I pulled out my phone and called Angela. Angela, we need to move fast. I've been doing some digging, and I found something that can bring this whole thing down. She answered after the first ring, sounding tense. What did you find? They're operating illegally, I said. The HOA wasn't properly incorporated when it was formed. Their whole system is a house of cards, and I've got the proof. But we need to move quickly before Patricia figures it out. There was a long pause. So, what do? We start organizing. We need to get the neighbors on our side. If they know what's really going on, they'll join us. But first, we need to make sure we have everything lined up legally. I'll talk to a lawyer, and you start spreading the word. Get people talking. If we can hit Patricia with this, she'll have no choice but to back off. Angela was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear the hesitation in her voice. I don't know, Nathan. What if it backfires? What if she comes after us? She will, I cut in. But that's the point. We can't let her keep running the show. This is the only way to stop her. Another silence, then Angela spoke, her voice softer. Okay, I'll do it. Let's bring this down. That was all I needed to hear. Angela was in. We were going to take Patricia down, and I knew just how to do it. I wasn't going to fight her with anger or threats. I was going to fight her with facts, and once I had those, she wouldn't stand a chance. I spent the next few days meeting with a lawyer, trying to get everything in order. I couldn't do this alone. This wasn't just about the swing or some fines. This was about challenging Patricia's entire hold over the neighborhood. The lawyer, a friend of mine from college, had helped me a few years ago when I'd bought the house. Now, he was helping me figure out the best way to dismantle the HOA's operation from the inside. We've got to hit her where it hurts, he said, after I laid out the situation. If the HOA wasn't properly incorporated, they have no legal standing. The fines they've been issuing, they're all invalid. I nodded, feeling a rush of relief. So, how do we go about proving it? It's not as hard as you might think, he said. I've seen this before. I'll pull up the records, check the incorporation documents. If they're incomplete or faulty, we've got a case. You'll need to gather support, though. Community members willing to speak out about what's been going on. That was where Angela came in. I called her that evening. I've got the proof, I said. The HOA is operating without the proper incorporation. Their whole structure is illegal. There was a pause on the other end. Are you serious? Yeah, and I'm going to prove it. That's huge, Angela said, her voice filled with surprise. What's the next step? We need to get the neighbors involved, I replied. If we can get a few of them to speak up about the abuse, we'll have everything we need. I'm counting on you to talk to the people around here, Angela. Get them on our side. I'm on it, she said, but we'll need to be careful. We don't want to stir the pot too much, not yet. I nodded. She was right. If we made too much noise too soon, Patricia might catch wind of what we were doing. We needed to gather support quietly, build our case, and then hit Patricia with everything we had. I could already feel the weight of the plan settling into place. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way to take Patricia down. The next few days felt like a blur. I spent hours poring over legal documents, combing through records, while Angela worked her magic in the neighborhood. People were hesitant at first, unsure of what they were getting into. But I could see the shift. More and more neighbors were starting to reach out, asking questions, expressing their frustration with the HOA. The cracks were starting to show, and we were going to be the ones to break the dam wide open. I knew it wasn't going to be enough just to gather support. We needed leverage, something that would force Patricia to back off. That's when I realized what I had to do. I had to make this personal. I wasn't just going to play by the HOA's rules. I was going to play by my own. I'd build a coalition, but I'd also create the conditions for Patricia to make a mistake. And when she did, I'd be ready to exploit it. I came home that evening, dusk folding the street into soft gray, thinking the worst was over. Angela had nudged a few neighbors into cautious conversation, and my lawyer said preliminary motions would be ready if we kept building support. Then I heard Ella scream. Her voice cut the air. I ran and saw her against the sycamore trunk, the swing ropes slack. Patricia stood a few feet away, hands on her hips, smiling with that small, certain cruelty she wore like perfume. A length of rope looped around Ella's wrist. She couldn't pull away. Something snapped. I crossed the yard in a few strides, grabbed Patricia's shoulder, and forced myself to speak calmly, though my insides were fire. "Take your hands off her," she let out a brittle laugh. "She was in the wrong place. I told her to call you." I untied the rope. My fingers trembled. Ella collapsed into me, burying her face in my shirt. Patricia's smile didn't change. Power, she thought, meant permission. That night, after Ella slept, I sat with the swing's shadow on the floor and the smell of cut grass in the kitchen. The incident was a message, a clear escalation. Letters were one thing. Staging my child's fear was another. It made the fight immediate. I called Angela. She was quiet for a long beat. "We can't let this be private," she said finally. "We need witnesses, statements, a record." She was right. I'd been building legal pressure methodically, but Patricia had forced the timeline. If I didn't act now, she'd keep raising the stakes. If I did act, I had to protect Ella and mobilize the neighborhood. We moved fast. I drafted a neutral notice to the private community forum, factual, terse, inviting people to a meeting at the community center to discuss governance and recent incidents. Angela started door knocking, collecting brief written accounts of harassment and copies of fines. My lawyer prepared a demand letter to halt targeted conduct and a preliminary motion to preserve evidence. I set up a small camera on the porch, aimed at the sycamore and front walk, discreet, legal, enough to capture interactions that could corroborate claims. I photographed the swing, the rope, Ella's wrist, the HOA letter. I timed calls and logged conversations. Each data point felt like a brick in a wall we were building around Patricia's abuses. Within 24 hours, the neighborhood that seemed anesthetized began to breathe. One neighbor scanned a year-old fine with no legal basis. Another texted a photo of a notice tacked to their fence. A retired teacher offered a short written account of being threatened over a vegetable garden. A young family admitted they'd been threatened with litigation after refusing to repaint shutters. Angela collected statements like someone gathering kindling for a long-burning fire. By evening, the list of supporters had grown. A handful agreed to come to the community center, some hesitant, some with a grim set to their faces. They brought faded notices, photos of inconsistent violations, and stories of being singled out. A few asked for anonymity. Angela arranged it. My lawyer drafted language for a preliminary injunction and an evidence preservation demand to send first thing in the morning. My anger focused into strategy. This was no longer about nostalgia for a swing. It was about safety and dignity and stopping someone who mistook intimidation for governance. I thought of my father's hands on this swing, showing me how to push off and fly, and that memory steeled me. Ella sleeping in the next room made the choice inevitable. We had to force Patricia into a position where her actions couldn't hide behind paperwork. We needed neighbors willing to sign statements, recorded patterns of selective enforcement, and documented incidents of intimidation. We had to make the harassment visible and undeniable. The decision hardened. I wasn't waiting for another stunt. I was committing my engineering mind, the lawyer's counsel, Angela's instincts, and the neighbors' voices to a single, coordinated push. Patricia had turned the HOA into a tool of private cruelty. Now it was time to make it count. Tomorrow, we'd start publicly, confronting her, by law, by witness, and with the whole neighborhood behind us. The community room smelled like coffee and old paper, rows of folding chairs lined under a humming, fluorescent light. We filled the front row with copies of notices and notes. Angela sat at the table with a stack of her own handwriting, looking smaller and steadier than she had in the yard. People trickled in, Mrs. Rivera from 2 houses down, the couple who ran the corner store, a retired school teacher, and a few faces I recognized but had never seen speak. I started with the facts. The swing incident, the letter, the rope. I kept my tone flat because anger would only weaken us in the eyes of strangers. When Angela stood and asked to say something, the room leaned in. She had been the quiet neighbor forever. For years she had smiled and nodded while Patricia ran the board. When she began, the tremor in her voice was real, but there was a hard clarity I hadn't seen before. Her story started small, an instruction here, a late notice there, but then she confessed a mistake she had carried for years. In a moment of misplaced trust, she had signed a line on an incorporation form Patricia handed her without reading the full document. She'd thought she was helping a neighbor. Patricia had been charming. Angela had been lonely and trusted the wrong person. That single signature, she said, had been used like a lever. Silence settled. Faces shifted. A man in the third row cleared his throat and offered a low corroboration. Patricia had once whispered that conformity kept property values up, and that people who questioned the board were trouble. A young couple produced a faded notice demanding they remove a planter box, an enforcement action that had never been applied consistently. One by one, small admissions pooled into a pattern. Then Angela did something else. Her hands went to her purse and she pulled out a torn photocopy she'd been hiding, an old meeting agenda with handwritten notes in Patricia's scrawl. In the margin, by a date months earlier, someone had written "pressure tactics" next to an agenda item. The phrase hit the room like a shard. She slid the sheet across the table to my lawyer, who read it twice before his face went still. "This is intent," he said softly, then louder. "This shows coordination. It's not negligence, it's a policy." The words sharpened everything. Suspicion translated into clarity. These weren't isolated slights. They were a system. Angela's photocopy tied the small cruelties together and made them look deliberate. Where our records showed procedural gaps, her testimony provided motive. After her confession, the room opened. Neighbors who had been silent offered brief accounts, an offhand promise that never held, a thinly veiled threat, a notice posted when others were ignored. A teacher described the way Patricia had attended social gatherings and quietly suggested standards. A store owner admitted to being approached with promises of leniency if he vouched for the board. Each anecdote was unglamorous, pedestrian, but together they etched a picture of abuse. When I spoke, I kept it simple and precise. I recounted the rope on Ella's wrist, the way Patricia had smiled as if she were administering discipline. I didn't raise my voice. I described times, places, words. People nodded, the lawyer took notes, asked clarifying questions, and Angela handed him a list of names willing to sign statements. She had been cautious about names, but now she placed trust in the group we'd gathered. A few stayed behind afterward, hands clasped, hesitant but animated. We agreed on a plan: preserve evidence, collect sworn statements, and file for injunctive relief to stop harassment. The lawyer would draft the motion, Angela would help gather signatures. I would continue documenting interactions, and neighbors would share copies of notices and emails. Walking home that night, the street felt different. The lamps sliced the pavement into bars of light and shadow. Angela walked beside me for a block and said nothing. Her confession had cost her a measure of safety, but it had given us something else, a clear thread to pull. For the first time since Patricia had started tightening her grip, I believed the board could be unraveled. We were ready to act, together, and to take whatever consequences came our way. The following morning, we moved quickly. The lawyer sent a formal letter to Patricia demanding that she cease the harassment immediately or face a lawsuit for wrongful enforcement. The language was measured, precise, professional, but beneath the calm, every word was a warning. This wasn't just about fines or the swing anymore. This was about holding her accountable for years of intimidation, for every unjust fine and every unwarranted threat. I couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. This was the moment where the tide started to shift. Patricia had been so sure that we would bend, that we would fold under pressure. She had underestimated how much we were willing to risk to take her down. Angela and I spent the day working the phones, confirming with neighbors that they were still on board. Each time someone agreed to speak, to sign, it felt like another small victory. The quiet houses around us were coming to life. People were talking. People were sharing their frustrations. For years, they had lived in the shadows of Patricia's rule, afraid to speak out, afraid of the consequences. Now, they were finding their voices. But I knew Patricia wouldn't back down that easily. She was too entrenched in this community, too convinced of her own power. She'd been playing this game for years, and she wasn't about to let some few people, especially not me, ruin her grip. The board meeting that evening would be her next move, and it was my chance to turn the tables on her. By the time the evening meeting rolled around, the tension in the rooms was palpable. I walked in with Angela, and the first thing I noticed was Patricia's smug, self-assured smile as she took her seat at the head of the table. The rest of the board members were already seated, looking as stiff and uninterested as usual, but this time, things were different. As I glanced around the room, I saw the faces of the neighbors who had agreed to show up. Some stood in the back, others sat at the sides, a quiet yet palpable energy in the air. This wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was a confrontation. Patricia stood when the meeting began, as usual, and started with her routine. The usual updates, the usual fines, the usual empty threats. But tonight, her voice faltered. A few minutes into her speech, I stood up, calmly walking to the front and placing the formal letter on the table. "I have a few things to add," I said, keeping my voice steady. Patricia's eyes narrowed, but she didn't interrupt. Her expression was still confident, still condescending, but I saw a flicker of something else, something close to fear, beneath her surface composure. I began with the basics, the illegal incorporation of the HOA, the evidence I had gathered, the notices that had been improperly served. But then I brought out the key piece, the handwritten agenda Angela had found. I placed it on the table for everyone to see, watching Patricia's face drain of color. "You've been targeting people for years," I said, addressing the board and the few neighbors who had gathered, "and now it's time we held you accountable for what you've done." Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but Angela was already stepping forward. With a calm, deliberate voice, she gave her confession, recounting how she had unknowingly helped Patricia build this system of control, how she had witnessed firsthand the intimidation and selective enforcement. She handed the photocopy of the agenda to one of the board members, who glanced down at it, his face growing tight with realization. The silence in the room was thick, the kind that precedes the breaking point. For the first time, Patricia's supporters were no longer so sure. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and some of the neighbors spoke up in quiet murmurs. The game had changed, and Patricia knew it. "I'll have you removed," she finally hissed, but there was no conviction in her words now. The threat, once a source of power, was a hollow echo. I turned to the rest of the room. "We're not afraid of you anymore," I said, my voice clear. "We're done living in the shadows." Patricia's shoulders sagged, her usual poise cracking. She knew. This wasn't just a few complaints, this was a collective, and her time was running out. The following week felt like a slow burn, tension thick in the air as we waited for Patricia's retaliation. But it never came, not directly. Instead, we watched as her usual tactics, those thinly veiled threats and intimidation, began to backfire. The HOA board, split and unsure, was no longer her loyal army. The cracks were widening, and once the cracks begin, they don't stop until the whole structure crumbles. Angela and I continued to meet with neighbors, building momentum. We knew Patricia would dig her heels in, but she was on the defensive now. Her power was built on fear, on her ability to divide and conquer, to make everyone think she was untouchable. But as the weeks passed, the more people began to speak up, the more her facade cracked. It wasn't until the next board meeting that we saw the full effect of our push. Patricia was visibly strained when we walked into the room. She tried to maintain her usual smug composure, but the weight of the scrutiny was impossible to ignore. The board members, once passive, were now divided. A few of them, those who had remained silent for so long, were shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, whispering to each other. They could feel the pressure mounting. Patricia could feel it too. I sat quietly, waiting for the right moment. When the meeting began, Patricia launched into her usual routine, but her words felt hollow, like an actor reciting lines they no longer believed in. The board, too, seemed less convinced by her usual rhetoric. She called for a vote on a new, revised set of community guidelines, one that would have included a clause giving the HOA even more control over property modifications. But this time, it didn't pass. I stood, calm but firm. "I have something to say," I said, interrupting her mid-sentence. "We've been patient, but we're done. This board is violating its own bylaws. The HOA is operating illegally, and we have the evidence to prove it." Patricia's eyes snapped to mine, fury replacing the feigned calm. But she didn't speak. She couldn't. I turned to the room, addressing the board members and the few neighbors who had gathered. "We've already seen that Patricia's leadership isn't just flawed. It's built on intimidation and lies. I'm calling for a vote to dissolve the current board and to put together a neutral committee that can rebuild this community fairly." The room went still. The board members shifted, unsure of how to respond. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand to silence her. "This isn't about me," I said, "or about one incident. This is about restoring fairness and transparency. The HOA is supposed to serve the people here, not control them." Angela was at my side now, standing firm. "It's time to restore the balance for everyone," she added, her voice strong and unwavering. The vote was called. The room was divided. Some voted to maintain the current board, some abstained, but most voted to remove Patricia and the others who had enabled her reign. The results were clear. The HOA was finally being forced into the light. Patricia didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her reign was over, at least for now. The board was no longer her puppet show. It was ours. As we walked out of the meeting, Angela and I exchanged a quiet, satisfied glance. We had done it. We had exposed Patricia's corruption, and in doing so, we had restored some sense of order to the community. But the work wasn't done yet. This victory was only the first step. We still had a long way to go before the HOA would be restructured, before the people who had suffered under Patricia's leadership could feel the full weight of the change. But for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. We had done something together that no one had thought possible. We had stood up, and we had won. The days after the board meeting felt almost surreal. The heavy weight that had pressed on the community for so long seemed to lift. But there was no immediate celebration, just the quiet hum of things settling. Patricia's departure was more than just symbolic. It was a victory for the entire neighborhood. But now, the real work began. Restructuring the HOA, creating a system that served the people rather than controlling them. Angela and I spent the next few weeks meeting with the new committee members, people who hadn't been involved in the old regime, people who were just as tired of the constant tension. There was a new energy in the air, one of cautious optimism, and a shared belief that things could finally be different. We all knew it would take time, that trust needed to be rebuilt, but the community had been given a second chance. We met in small groups discussing what the new HOA should look like. A few things were non-negotiable: transparency, accountability, fairness. I was surprised by how many people were willing to put in the time to make sure this change wasn't temporary but lasting. I could see it in their eyes, the hope that we might have finally reclaimed our neighborhood from a system that had used us for far too long. One afternoon, as we sat in the community center, the door opened and a familiar face stepped in. Marcus, one of the original board members who had been swept along in Patricia's tide, but hadn't fully bought into the way things had been run. He was hesitant at first, lingering by the door, as though unsure whether he should even be there. "Marcus," Angela greeted him, a small but sincere smile on her face. "I wasn't expecting you." "I wasn't sure either," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "I was just wondering if there was room for someone who didn't exactly oppose everything, but didn't quite support how things went down either." Angela exchanged a quick look with me before gesturing for him to sit down. "We need people who want to make things better, Marcus. It's not about the past. It's about the future." He nodded and took a seat at the table, and for the first time in what felt like years, the air didn't feel like it was crackling with tension. Marcus didn't come with a vendetta. He came with a willingness to do what was right. That was all we needed. Over the next few days, I found myself revisiting the swing, the spot where everything had started. It still stood, a silent sentinel in my front yard. But the rope was cut, the harsh reminders of Patricia's rule gone. Ella loved it again, playing on it without fear. It was just a swing now, a reminder of what we had fought for, not just for me, not just for my family, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had been pushed around for too long. I stood there for a while, watching the swing move in the breeze. In the distance, I could hear the hum of the new committee meeting at the community center. Angela was there, along with Marcus and the others, discussing bylaws, community events, and most importantly, how to rebuild trust. It felt strange, but in the best possible way, to know that we had turned a corner. We were no longer just a group of neighbors afraid of what would happen next. We were a community coming together to create something better. I turned back toward the house and saw Ella playing with the neighbors' kids, laughing without a care. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace settle in my chest. The battle had been long, and at times it had felt like it might break us. But here we were, stronger than before, with the power to build something that would last. It wasn't over, not entirely. There would always be more work to do. But for the first time, I believed in the community again. The power was ours to wield. The public confrontation with Patricia had been the first domino to fall, but now came the real test. Could we keep the momentum going? Could we continue to make this community about us, the people, rather than a few individuals hoarding power? The new HOA committee had its work cut out for it. There were bylaw revisions to make, new leadership to establish, and most importantly, trust to rebuild. But the energy in the room at every meeting was different now. Gone were the days of fear and intimidation. We didn't have to fight for a voice anymore. We had it, and we were using it. It was the first public meeting since Patricia's removal, and this time, the air in the room was thick with anticipation. Neighbors stood at the back, whispering to each other, unsure what to expect. The board sat, more unified than before. Angela and I walked in together, our presence no longer an act of rebellion, but of leadership. The committee was diverse, young, old, new residents, longtime homeowners, each person bringing something unique to the table. Marcus, still adjusting to his new role, stood at the podium first. He wasn't an orator, but his words carried weight. We're here tonight to begin a new chapter. We've been given an opportunity to correct what's been broken for so long, and that's exactly what we plan to do. His words were met with a quiet nodding from the room. The community's collective, breath held in anticipation. We had made it clear that this wouldn't be just a meeting where the HOA did its usual business. This was a place for neighbors to speak, to share concerns, and most importantly, to be heard. The first few discussions focused on small but significant changes. How fines would be handled more transparently, how decisions about neighborhood projects would be made with everyone's input, and how the new board would hold itself accountable to the residents. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time, the atmosphere was respectful, inclusive. Then, towards the end of the meeting, an older woman named Mrs. Hadley, a longtime resident, stood up. She'd been quiet for the entire meeting, watching, listening, but when she spoke, it was like a weight had lifted from her. "I've lived here for 30 years, she began, her voice strong but tired. I remember when this place was a community, when it felt like we all knew each other, looked out for each other. But it's been years since it felt that way. It felt like the HOA was something that happened to us, not something we were part of. It's good to hear your ideas about change, but I want to know, how can we make sure this never happens again?" The room went silent. Mrs. Hadley's question was the one everyone had been dancing around, but no one had wanted to say it aloud. How do we protect what we've started? How do we prevent the old ways from creeping back? Angela was the first to answer. "Transparency," she said, her voice steady. "We need open records, open meetings. We need to be accessible, and we need to hold each other accountable. Every decision, every action, there needs to be a record of it, and we need to make sure everyone knows they can come to us, talk to us. No one should ever feel like they're being ruled from the top down again." I could see the energy shift in the room. Mrs. Hadley smiled, and the tension in the room seemed to dissipate. The vote at the end of the meeting was symbolic, but it felt important. Everyone who attended voted to adopt the new bylaws, making the changes official. The room was filled with murmurs of approval, but the real victory was the shift in the atmosphere. The people weren't just passive recipients of decisions anymore, they were participants. After the meeting, Angela and I stood outside, watching the community members trickle out into the night, their voices full of hope, full of plans. We had fought hard to get to this point, but we knew that our real job wasn't just removing Patricia. It was ensuring the new board remained accountable, that the community stayed engaged, and that the work didn't stop. Angela turned to me with a smile, a small, quiet victory in her eyes. We did it. I nodded, watching the people who had fought alongside us walk into the future of this neighborhood. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was real. It was ours. It's been months since the last meeting, and the change in the neighborhood is tangible. The sun sets a little differently now, the golden light spilling over sidewalks where neighbors once kept to themselves. There's a quiet hum in the air, like the neighborhood itself is waking up, shedding years of tension and distrust. I sit on the front porch, a cold drink in hand, watching Ella swing back and forth, her laughter light and unburdened. For the first time in ages, I don't feel the weight of Patricia's shadow hanging over us. I don't feel the quiet anxiety of wondering what the HOA would do next, how they'd target someone else or enforce some arbitrary rule. For the first time, the community is ours. It feels like something permanent, something we can hold on to. The new HOA board, despite its rough start, is proving to be more than just a reaction to Patricia's reign. They're committed, they're transparent, and most importantly, they're accountable. Decisions are being made with the input of everyone, not just a few people in an office with no regard for the residents who actually live here. People talk now, not just about their lawns, but about the future of the community, about how we can support each other, how we can make sure that no one ever feels isolated or afraid again. I've learned more in these months than I ever expected to. Leadership isn't about power, it's about trust, it's about listening. It's about being the person who stands up when no one else will, but it's also about knowing when to step back and let the voices of others be heard. This wasn't just my fight, it was everyone's fight. And the victory, the real victory, isn't in the moment the board is dissolved or Patricia is removed. It's in the quiet, everyday changes. It's in the way neighbors stop to chat, the way they smile at each other in the streets. It's in how a simple swing on the front lawn becomes a symbol of something larger than a fight over property rights. Angela and I still meet regularly, though now it's more about strategy for upcoming community events than about the battle we fought so hard. The work isn't done, but it's different now. The energy is positive. We're not fighting against something anymore. We're building something together. There's still the occasional challenge. It's never perfect, and there will always be issues to work through. But we have the right foundation now, and that makes all the difference. We've learned what happens when you take a stand, when you say, enough is enough. But we've also learned the power of collaboration, of understanding that we're all in this together. As the meeting adjourns and the community comes to life in its new form, I take a moment to reflect. The community that once lived in fear has found its voice. The HOA that once ruled by intimidation now stands as a model for what happens when people take control of their own lives. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, when you've done the impossible, when you fought back and won, then you know what this moment feels like. It's not just victory, it's the beginning of something that will last. And if you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.